Hello everyone, today we talk about the Timurid army organization. This is really the first time we talk about the Timurids, the Timurid Empire. Specifically, we start from this military topic. Tomorrow, by the way, and totally randomly, we will talk a bit about the broader history behind this military system. I will stick to it and actually trying to introduce it more than else, not just because I'm not particularly expert. I've read just a bunch of things about it, but I would love to know a lot more, and we will make a lot more of Timurid history videos, but also because it's a dramatically fascinating topic, and we will observe it now, getting acquainted a bit with the Timurid milieu, if you want to call it in this way, through their armies, right? So, as you know, probably the Timurid Empire takes the name after Timur. Timur, the name Timur-Lenk in Persian would be a corruption of the term that was in origin this really minor chieftain of the Balras that was fundamentally a Turkicized Mongol clan, right? That eventually managed to create this enormous empire based on the land of Transoxiana with its capital Samarkand, of which he became ruler in 1370. This empire basically stretched from today's Turkey to Delhi, and from the Central Asian steppes to the Iraqi marshlands. It was a pretty enormous thing. So it encompassed at the acme of its power the region of Transoxiana, of Khwarezmia, Persia, Azerbaijan, Afghanistan, Turkestan, as we said, parts of Iraq, of Anatolia, and even expanding, taking this routes of invasion towards several other directions, both against the Golden Horde, the Sultanate of Delhi, the Mamluks in Syria and Egypt, into Turkey proper, when the Ottoman armies are crushed at the Battle of Ankara in 1402, and it would, by the way, has for the history even of the West an important effect, because it kind of belated the Ottoman advance in Europe for more than at least 30 years. And therefore we're talking really about something big that lasted, as we will see now, up to for less than 1 century basically, and that however had radically important effects on the history of all of these regions. By the way, Timur the Lame died in 1405, the beginning of 1405, by attempting to invade China itself, Ming China. And he might have accomplished that, really, because he was definitely wanted to revive the Mongolian rule, let's say, in there, but also importing Islam, and in fact being supported by, say, substantial minority that existed in the Tianchao. And therefore you have to look at this broader dimension. It actually comes from and chiefly from the two prevalent, let's say, ethnical elements that composed the empire. It was the Turkic, or Turkic, I don't know how you pronounce that, and Mongol one, right? The same Timur actually stemmed from the first, but this was a situation after the Mongolian conquests were definitely this idea of the Persianate. Everything was very mixed, and definitely Persian culture had come to encompass wide areas, had both in the north, in this steppe lands, but also in the rest of the Muslim world, and had been expanded further actually by the same Mongol conquest. The 14th century is the century of great crisis, not just of the Mongol Empire as such, but of many systems. The Mongols, as you know, had managed to create this empire that stretched across most of Asia. Basically, just India and a few other parts were not conquered, and this caused, even had a great impact on Europe. Europe at this time, thanks to the relative political unity following the Mongol conquests, is able to trade extensively with China and vice versa. And so the 14th century is a moment of great crisis, colding of the climate, plague spreading, economical contraction, demographic contraction, and political fragmentation. So Timur originated his power from this world that had never quite settled down. Really, this is broader Islamic world that sometimes, for the sake of stressing the threat that sometimes it posed, as definitely in terms of invasions, thinking about the Ottoman Empire, we like to depict as kind of a monolithic thing, but actually the Islamic world was way more fragmented actually than the Christian one, or at least, however, had a certain degree of instability that brought it to take this radically different courses in history. And it was also a very powerful blender of civilization in the meanwhile and of war, right? If there hadn't been a collapse of the Mongolian Empire and also an internal crisis of the Ilkhanate of Persia, figures like the one of Timur could have not raised at the time. This is important to take into account. I stressed the element, the Turkish here, or the Turkic and Mongol elements, because of the deep, let's say, compenetration of these elements. The Turks of the steppes remain this ethnical element that never, that had already poured extensively into the same Islamic world from a lot of time. The Mongols are the last arrivals there in the 13th century, and they managed to take over. So the Turks proper had been absorbed. Think about the Mongol conquest brings to an end of the Seljuk Empire. That, yes, it was Turkic in name, but basically they were the Seljuks were Persians in terms of culture, language, even military tradition in part, but also with this, let's say, touch of Turkic element that was continuing to pour, because this was really the thing in there that also contributed heavily to the in fact, to the fragmentation, to the instability of the Islamic world. This moments of the steppes continued to pour in, and that was pretty advantageous, especially for anyone who wanted to create utter mess from a political and military point of view, because, hey, there's plenty of these guys that are hungry out there that I can pay for fighting, and they're already naturally bred warriors on their own, so they keep pouring in. And what the Mongol element had taken over as the great imperial model, right? In the West we had very different bases that were fundamentally based on Christian universalism. There was if you want an abstraction even of what well, there are comparisons that can be drawn technically, but let's say that the Mongolian invasions had brought in this more I can't say wilder, because it sounds bad and it's kind of kind of a contemporary term, but let's say this much stronger emphasis, this is better, on the military side, on the idea of the Khanate, on the idea of this great overlordship of the steppe, right? That was actually accepted as the or imposed, depending on how you want to see it, even among these other populations that were naturally quite different, and that, however, knew what the steppe really was about. And the same Persia that, in fact, was quite different from the other millenary civilizations out there, because definitely was an ancient one, but at the same time, Persia was never that solidly centralized and Stata-like an empire that other entities had been. Persia actually develops much into this period, but in this sense it does it still more on a kind of a semi-nomadic or nomadic base that is reminiscent, in fact, of the culture of the steppes, either Aryan or Turkic or Mongol, that, however, reinvigorates that idea of the overlordship, that is based on political and especially military, and that is obviously, let's say, immediately transferred into the military dimension, right, where there is this great hierarchy that has also this greater meaning, greater figure, because it's a huge hierarchy that is at the same time extremely fluid, but still encompasses this celestial mandate, if you want. It is typical of the steppes to rule over the others, and that is something that is legitimized by the same heavens, basically. A system that the Turks, by the way, widely recognize, because it's essentially the same one they have emerged from. Okay, the Mongols and the Turks are different, as the Indo-Europeans are, but basically the steppe is this great cauldron into which everything, independently from your ethnical origin, that also in here in its ethnogenesis is very difficult and very complicated to actually focus on, because definitely among what we call as ethnic Turks, it was full of people that genetically were, from other elements, from the Aryans, from the Mongols, etc. And this was perfectly normal, because ethnicity here doesn't mean what you really look like, but really under which laws you are, and under which confederation you work, right? And so that's particularly fluid in the steppe, but there is this brutally homogenizing factor that is a war in itself. That's what all you do. Yeah, but the steppes are not exactly all the same thing. Sometimes we think of the steppe like this brutal, primitive, and wild world where people are just nomads because they can't do anything else with it. Well, it's not completely like that. The steppes can be very diversified in many ways, and that's where, in fact, it's beautiful to start with the Timurid Empire, because that's the base. Where the base of the empire was rooted, into this land of Transoxiana, north of the Oxa River, that had been, if you will, in many ways the border of civilization. In many ways, it was an area of frontier between the steppes and the sedentary world, but also between China and, let's say, Western Eurasia, and that therefore had developed quite interesting characteristics. Transoxiana actually saw the constant actually coexistence of the fully sedentarized but also the fully nomadic element that all naturally had a kind of a gray area in the middle. Transoxiana had seen historically the rise of very important centers that also, by the way, the Mongols in part had razed to the ground when they had arrived, including the very ancient city of Merv, that at the time in 13th century seemingly was the largest city in the world. And that, however, had this quick recovery capability, let's say, as trade centers chiefly. Transoxiana had been fundamentally about that, a bit about being in the middle of these trade routes that were the crossroad of all the whole Eurasian continent, and that therefore could develop as very consistent centers and a crossroads of ideas, of wisdoms, of technologies, of science. This had an impact even in terms of military organization, and that's what renders this so beautiful. And the most important center, in fact, after this had become in this period had become Samarkand, that in fact is the starting point of Timur in many ways, and this huge empire, as we have seen, also is polycentric, right? When you say the capital is, it's very relative, especially in the mindset now we see of the steppes, because the Turkic element in Tamerlane remains pretty strongly. It remains the idea that this is not really a great sedentary empire, but it's still part of the steppe legacy, right? And if you look at at Timurid armies, they're actually much closer to Mongol ones, as we will see now in organization, than to any other model out there, in spite, of course, were any and wildly different forms of military organizations, especially at a local level, because obviously the places controlled had different traditions, and also contingents from many different peoples poured in Tamerlane's army, right? And when we look at the Timurid Empire, we tend to say, well, that this achievement was fragile. I mean, this empire basically began immediately to fragment and to remain unstable, right? It actually lived on, and this is still important, especially in those contexts, because the fact that these things survived the death of the great leader, of the great commander, was fundamentally rare. But so this block went on, but it went along very similar lines, which the Mongols basically had transformed. Basically, you have all these. There is a central dynasty, right? Tamerlane has the. He's not really a Khan. He can't be, because fundamentally, even though he fabricated certain legends about it, and he even married one of the Mongolian princesses, actually he was never recognized as the Khan. He had other fundamentally other titles or other recognitions that are also part of the Islamic world. Actually, he was an emir as well as other titles, because he was also Islamic. This was all. It was a very fascinating mix, in fact, between Mongol tradition, and Islamic one. The Mongols initially had been hostile to Islam. There was a moment in which they thought even to convert. At least they took into consideration to convert to Christianity. But it was still largely, let's say, politist, in the sense that they could accept any kind of element. It was perfectly normal to the Mongol nobility. It was a way basically to content a bit everyone, to make more people joining their confederations, because that's how they used to grow fundamentally, in the lack of another gluing factor rather than the force of arms. But this now they had converted, right, and therefore Timur represents this great leader that, in fact, is both in the Mongol tradition and in the Islamic one. It is particularly interesting because every time you look, even in Seljuk times, etc., all the times which basically these elements of the steppes are poured into the sedentarized and Muslim world, you see that there is the persistence, if you want, of a sort of pagan ethos, at least, that also is declined sometimes according to the Islamic dictamina, let's say, that however always stresses the true love, the natural inclination towards the great, the model of the steppes, that is definitely brutal and based on this relations of force, but doesn't have to be considered as a as a negative element. There is all a black legend developing around Timur. This idea that was spread actually largely by the same Timurid propaganda, because it was a very effective deterrent mean. About the ferocious slaughters, exterminations, and destructions, was definitely happened, but there were always calculated. When this idea of the when we should open a massive parenthesis on the sources of all these stories, because naturally, even how we will see now with the army organization, when you look at the numbers, etc., that they're all you have to understand the mindset of the time. Not everything that is written in sources is real. You can't quote a source and pretending that it's telling the truth just because it's a source of the 14th century of those times. You have to go beyond, and naturally, every time you read, you observe this massacres, etc. Obviously, you may wonder, why was this done? Was there an option, etc. But at the same time, especially when you take into consideration this very broad political and military dynamics, you realize that most of the times these were coldly calculated massacres that had actually a very important deterrent function, that lay at the base of the same foundations, basically, of these empires. We were talking some days ago about the Gallic Wars and Julius Caesar. Well, you can't understand the Roman slaughters in the Gallic Wars if you don't understand the strategical situation, what was needed at that point in terms of deterrence to do, not to do, which doesn't mean to justify what happened, but definitely if you had that objective and you wanted to accomplish it, well, that was not only the necessary but also the most intelligent way to get out of there. And it turns out that these things always had a kind of rational reason. It wasn't just about the great chieftain of the steppes, bloodthirsty and maniac and all this stuff. No, it wasn't like that. These are prejudices that we have either as modern people, sometimes even as maybe coming from one culture rather than another, which is not to make moral relativism, because I find it disgusting. I do believe that there is always someone who is more right than others. But it still has, these judgments should come from a real acknowledgement of the sources, studies, and it's something that takes years. That, if you've just read, I don't know, an Osprey book about it, well, you may know something about it. You may, especially if you have read something else in the meanwhile about other stories, but that's not really what you can assess just on the basis of your guts, because, it makes you feel better, morally speaking. That's not really how history should be done. And that's a general rule, because at the end of the day, humans all function, and human societies actually tend to function all in the same way. So the more you actually abstract even from the individual by certain standards, and the more you realize that certain patterns, by the way, are similar. We're talking about the 14th century, the 15th century. It's not that societies were all very different from each other, especially if you take, I don't know, Europe, the Middle East, etc. Well, there were pretty approximable, let's say, as very similar societies, yet their differences in detail are important at the same time. And this also consider what the level of the scale of these empires. We have seen that, think about what 14th century or 15th century Europe really was about. Was nothing like Tamerlane Empire in terms of size, of extension, of populations controlled, etc. It was, very different. Europe was slowly evolving, definitely towards something that locally especially was more advanced, but in overall, like, these huge empires were something very different to manage than, say, an average European kingdom. And they also therefore required this kind of, the larger the system is, and the more it burns, which means that the more you have what seems to be senseless slaughters, or someone that remains left out in this sense, and that pays the side effects, let's say, of a leadership of power, as sad as it can be. So what happened eventually in the Timurid dynasty, that definitely was set in the sense as a dynasty, right? It wasn't a collegial, there was a bloodline that is also defining of for the legitimization of power. So you have, like, a bit like with the Mongols happened, that there are several regions that share this Timurid legacy, but they're all emblood in the ruling lineage, but they all quarrel with each other and fight against each other. There is one center in Herat, another in Khorasan, another in Transoxiana, and many other actually smaller principalities that at that time were in fact the normality, if you take the average power in the world at the time. And the reasons of this disgregation now are too complicated now to explain, and given that this video should be about military organization, we all only talked about historical background right now, but it's still important to make you understand these dimensions, because otherwise, how can you understand really how that army can be organized, really? So let's skip, the end of the Timurid rule that, however, happened in 1507. The base was Persia, at least at the end of this power, because, by the way, that's a bit how it always happened. It had happened for the Turks, it had happened for the Mongols, it happens for this empire too, that basically the conqueror becomes conquered by the local culture, and Persia always remains this obvious base of power, like a bit like Mesopotamia. Well, Mesopotamia is a bit in a trouble now, but let's say that it's a bit like the Ottomans took the Byzantines' place, or how Egypt always remained a center of power, because there are certain local structural factors that always bring to that. And Persia effectively has this ability to replicate its own power in this sense. I mean, the idea that it's a solidly civilized country, but it's also very diverse. So it has a strong sedentary basis, but still it's not quite like those other fully sedentarized regions. So there is room also for settling these other populations of the steppes that can form the bulk of your armies, and to progressively integrate into the system. So it's also protected. It's close to very rich areas like Mesopotamia. It can control in the north the trade routes with the Far East, essentially. It has many options, let's say, and therefore has this intrinsic advantages you can see even now, where Iran is still, the Persian Empire out there fundamentally, and it kind of replicates itself historically on this base. So there had been definitely certain revivals of Timurid power, for example. In 1469, Khorasan was conquered by Mirza Ulugh Beg, for example, etc. So there are this kind of fluctuating powers, right? And the military organization proper, let's get to it, under Tamerlane had remained basically, and I say basically, the same like under Genghis Khan, right? This is really what happens all over the formerly Mongol-ruled world at the end of the day, and especially and more accentuated in these regions that are pretty close to, well, in this case not to Mongolia proper, but let's say to that system of the steppes that, as we have seen, was shared by not just by the Mongols but also by this Turkic populations and so on. So, for example, the Tartars of the Golden Horde that were also neighboring the Timurid Empire and also suffer pretty heavy defeat at the end of Timur, had the same armies of their own ancestors. And this is something that really never changes. Like, if you look at even during World War II, were still, horse archers being recruited in certain, think about the Bashkirians or other populations, but both in the Soviet and in the Nazi armies that were out there. Because it turns out that in a steppe, that's the best thing you can do. And there are certain things that never change. I mean, even in terms of armor, of weaponry, obviously there is maybe some change in detail, there are sometimes relatively massive changes too, but the function and the broader efficacy of this remains. It remains at least until Renaissance warfare kicks in, because excuse me, obviously the nomads of the steppes do not transition into centralized states like with pike and shot, but they are invaded by peoples that, like the Russian, for example, Russians, for example, that are armed in that fashion, that manage to basically represent a tactically unresolvable puzzle for the horse archer, right? That basically can't make it through, and that's how Timotheyevich conquered Siberia, incidentally. So, but we will see it another time. In any case, in here we are, by the way, still at the dawn of even of firearms. We'll see now even how what are the hypotheses about the employment of black powder into Timurid armies. So, talking about this Mongol military organization then, so in the Timurid army, starting from the smaller units, there was this Onlik or Arban of 10 men, was commanded by an officer called Onbashi. Then the Yuzlik or Koshun of 100 men, commanded by the Yuzbashi. Then the Binlich or Mingan of 1,000 men commanded by a bin bashi, also called a gin bashi or ming bashi, and then the Tuman, the famous Tuman, Genghis Khan's armies, like of 10,000 men. So actually, these levels are all multiples of 10. The average was really this. There was all units that had all 10 times the various effectives, and it was a sensible choice, perhaps. And now I can't go too much in detail to this, but let's say that was one of the simplest ways to organize them, and to and that really tells you, by the way, about the dimension of these armies and their flexibility, their fluidity. Other armies are kind of relatively more complex. One of the steps, one mounted function. Actually, these were highly complex armies, but let's say that they had certain functions that made them more fluid and relatively more homogeneous also than we tend to think. We'll see now that the horse archer by himself is relatively homogeneous. I mean, the armies of the steppes have a pretty similar face, the one to the other. But these were still troops that were not entirely from the steppes, so they had a further process of uniformation that came from naturally the availabilities of resources of the empire, that also struck, for example, some contemporary observers that went to know Timur and his court and his army, that were surprised by the degree of relatively uniformity, right? You know that uniforms do not appear basically in the modern sense of the term before the 17th century, but throughout all the ancient and medieval times, there have been units that were kind of wearing at least the same colors, or generally speaking had some form of uniformity, some degree of uniformity in essential in the ideal, right? And the functionality in there is always tactical, and it's very important to see that, because you realize that the more an army is uniform, and the more is meant to function recognizably. I mean, in the sense that, if you have a unit that is all, say, colored in one fashion, that means that you have to distinguish it in a mass of other units that presumably are doing other things in the meanwhile. So that really tells you that it's a very important way to recognize from the above what's going on, because there is a strong leadership and also great complexity and dynamism in tactically speaking. The two men, as this larger army of 10,000 men, was commanded by an emir, so an emir fundamentally. So you see that these are a bit of a mix of Mongol and Turkic and even Arab names that really exemplify at its best the cultural background of Timurid armies. There were also other types of units, of course, that also we can't clearly maybe understand how much in what they really consisted in, but there are, for example, the ally that perhaps were of 1,000 troops, just like the Binlings, as they are called ally beguis, that are, by the way, extremely similar to the Ottoman ala bey, by the way, because, by the way, not just the Timurids fought against the Ottomans, they were in contact with them in Anatolia, etc., but still the Ottomans were basically very influenced also by Mongol warfare, by this idea still of the steppes. We have been talking about Ottoman warfare, observing how it was really probably unique in many ways, at least in the moment in which it started to evolve from its, let's say, traditional Turkic base and started to centralize, which did it in a remarkably close fashion to the Western one. And but at the same time, the part of the Ottoman leadership still stemmed from this idea of the Khan, and that's the reason why the Ottomans, for example, revered the Golden Horde, and though at a certain point they even crushed them and they defeat them at least, and they're even more powerful. But there is this idea still that there is this greater overlordship of the steppes that comes with this also higher forms of organization that were recognized by all these peoples that had, in a way or another, all, an origin in the steppes, because also the Turks had, as we've seen. And therefore it's also relatively funny to observe that, in fact, the names of ranks and units in the Timurid armies were similar to, for example, the Ottoman ones. For example, even a unit called Feudi was sometimes encountered that was probably something similar of 100 men. It was a sort of a squadron, right? And but also in here we can't fully grasp sometimes how much they were. So on the battlefield today we will not talk about tactics strictly, but as you understand, these populations were mostly the Timurids at least made extensive use of horse archers, right? And this both qualitative and numerical elite of heavy cavalry that was a tradition of all the steppes, even of Persia, etc. And that fundamentally fought in similar ways, right? If you are to observe fundamentally the tactics used by, I don't know, what did we talk about on Schwerpunkt? Even by the Russians. The Russians at this point have basically identical armies to the ones of the Mongols. Maybe just they have some more infantry actually, maybe coming from this more sedentary world, villages and towns, but the types of troop, the tactical function, and therefore the formation are pretty similar. There is usually this center that is obviously the bulk of the army, that also comprises the khans, guards, and also the elite troops. And then you have the wings, obviously, that are different because they're never symmetrical, simply because humans do not, for humans left and right is not really the same thing. So usually the right wing is the stronger one. It's in the Timurid armies is called the Burungar, and the left one, the Chuvangar. The center is called Kul, actually, and then there is a vanguard as well that usually has the task of obviously of skirmishing or screening, and that is known as Manglai. And usually this was the formation, and naturally there are many combinations after all, but also bear in mind that all these chunks, now they're not a few, they're basically 4, and the more you fragment an army in terms of unit, the more it becomes difficult to maneuver, really. So there are not enormously complicated formations at this point in history. There is their interaction that can really be pretty active and dynamic. The steppes peoples have this natural lust for ambushes, feint flights, and encirclements and stuff like that, and that was obvious because they had the best units for carrying out such maneuvers. That was light cavalry. It was the bulk of the army. And the Khan's guard was particularly was definitely the elite. It was the bodyguard as well. Therefore, it had to be particularly fit and resistant, and it was made up of the best men of the sovereign. For example, at the Battle of Kondurka River in 1391, where Tamerlane defeated the Golden Horde Khanate, he had a a guard composed by the bravest soldiers that counted 20 Casualties, that is to say 20 per 100. It's 2,000, and therefore, yeah, this means basically something like 20 squadrons, if you want. And so talking about, apparently at this point there is nothing really distinctive of Timurid armies compared to other Mongol armies, let's say. And we also have problems, as often it happens for Mongol armies, to determine the overall, the total strength, right, of field armies at least. Because as you know, it's very tricky. Sometimes you find numbers that do not even explain you whether we're talking about the entire potential of an empire, which definitely can realistically total to very high numbers, but that's something that is never really put on the field, also because it's impossible to move more than 50,000 fighters at one time to coordinate them, and to, you can't even put them out there. But if they're so disorganized that there is a degree of attrition in there, that of friction, that definitely at one point becomes a burden. Always remembered in military history that whoever tells you at these times, in Middle Ages, in the ancient world, that there were armies that were commanded from the field that were larger than 50,000 fighting men, you can legitimately say it's false, right? In fact, here we find actually numbers that are higher than that. For example, in the campaign into Persia, the Timurid of 1393, the Timurid army allegedly counted 17,000, which is pretty large. The army that marched and against and sacked Delhi in India in 1398 allegedly comprised 92 bingliks, so 92,000 troops. There are even higher numbers, like a 200 claimed for both the Kondurja, let's say the Golden Horde campaign, let's say, and in 1391, and the one against China that was eventually aborted at the death of Timurid in 1405, with 240,000. Excuse me, of 200,000, and even 240,000 at the invasion of Syria at the beginning of the 15th century, 1401. Naturally, the question is, now I don't want to digress into it because it's kind of, but many people say, well, you have to count the civilians, because every army at the time had lots of civilians around: merchants, craftsmen, pioneers, slaves, field aides, prostitutes, the families. As we will see now, that especially Timurid armies were meant to basically move with all their families together, which was, it's probably a cliche actually of the tradition of the steppe, like that it's as if it was the world people on the march. Sometimes it wasn't really very far from that, in telling the truth, but still, an army has to work as one. So even all these people bring a terrible and dramatic effort into all logistical maneuvers. So what does this mean? Well, it means that, for example, the 240,000 troops that are mentioned for the Syrian campaign, where the Timurids defeat and humble the Mamluks, they march over on Damascus, are referred to, let's say, to have been composed actually of only 30,000 soldiers. I mean, combat force, right? So which means that theoretically we're something like 200 10,000 troops, civilians with them. Well, that's also a bit too much. Obviously, there wasn't, and also I don't find any valuable reason for which you have to bring hundreds of thousands of civilians, that is the population of an entire region of Central Asia, just to do what, fundamentally? I mean, one thing is going there naturally with all the necessary, that definitely was in the case. Think about even these were all prevalently mounted armies, so it needed, for example, just the horses. We know that actually the real problem of these armies, especially the ones of the steppes, was really the heavily conditioned how even campaigns were led, etc. was the logistical needs of horses. Horses drink and eat an astonishingly great amount of stuff. It's incredible. You can't move an army with even tens of thousands of horses when you in a certain season where rivers dry up. So you have to consider all of these elements. Such numbers of hundreds of thousands are totally ridiculous. So I don't think personally that Timurid armies, even at the greater of their of their power, surpassed something like 30,000 actually fighting force, right? And maybe 50,000 in summing these civilians. And yes, I believe the civilians were obviously much less than the fighting force, for reasons now that are kind of complicated to explain, but definitely have to do also with managing these people at the end of the day. And we're talking especially about troops that were perfectly capable in the most natural steppes tradition to actually literally live on horseback. That is to say that everything they needed, they took it from their own horses. They drank the horse's blood. They cooked their meat between the pikes and the horse where they were riding. They could sleep on horseback. Once Tamerlane is meant to have inspected his army. This is an anecdote, and there was a guy, a soldier, a warrior, is sleeping on horseback during duty, and he said something, that guy should be killed. And after a while, he when he went back in his quarters in his tent, he was surprised when he was brought the head of that guy that he hadn't explicitly ordered to get killed. But that gives you an idea. Obviously, this is you can't say it didn't happen, but it's obviously an exemplum. It's simply an anecdote to actually mean that, obviously in this case, it's not really about the discipline, because if that was really had been really about the discipline, Timur would have slaughtered the guy with his own hand. But about the fate now, the obedience to Timur that his subordinates showed, because definitely great part of the political and military authority of the steppes stemmed from fear. That is particularly important. It's one of the defining characters of the steppe warrior in many ways, and it is so. For also in here, every time we should open a parenthesis, but we can't. But it has naturally to do with the fact that such huge empires that were held together by these very highly mobile armies obviously needed sometimes to go away for a long time, as sometimes even the totality of the armed forces from places that at that point could rebel. So coming in one place and slaughtering everyone was not a proof of evil by itself, but it was simply the only way these guys could keep an empire together. And by the way, avoiding utter strife, because I don't know obviously how the Mongol or Timurid massacres were really a medicine not to make die other people during revolts and other civil strifes, but see that actually when these empires crumbled, everybody started fighting each other endemically, as always, as a normal datum of political and military dialectics. So it's still part of how you keep an empire working, right? And so going back on numbers, that was my thought. I mean, you don't even really need huge armies. I mean, historically speaking, when you have huge armies, it's either because you have to need this reserve because you preemptively put into account the fact that a campaign is going to be of dramatic effort, of consumption, of length. It's not a surprise that actually we see the campaign against the Golden Horde in China with and also Syria with such high numbers, because those were campaigns that were launched very far, substantially from the center, let's say, of the empire, and therefore, you know, it was expected that you had to do also a lot of other things, even the presence of civilians. You know, you need an administration, you need people you have to live in locally to deal with all the in fact the local organization and creating other logistical support, etc., and controlling supplies line, and the same, and obviously keeping also the supply lines free, the supply line safe. So even troops were obviously always going back and forth. It was full of explorers, of spies. By the way, Timurid developed an extremely sophisticated communication system with carrier pigeons. That is quite important. It was practiced extensively also in the armies of the steppes, because this empire was enormous, and you have definitely to invest on these control systems, because you have not today's technology. You don't know what's going on out there, so you need means to know things quick, right? And that can really make the difference also between victory and defeat of and, you know, life and death of not of just of yourself, but of the whole empire. There is this very strong Mongol face of the Timurid armies, as we said. In fact, a Castilian diplomat, González de Clavillo, visited Tamerlane's court in 1404, and he's not the only one. Actually, we have even French and German witnesses, and so the Westerners start to write. What is interesting is that also the difference in sources production in here. You know, the West was already kind of more, say, modernized in mind. It had, even historically speaking, a certain interest to really document things in a more, you know, in a more concrete way than the local chronicles, for example, wanted, because local chronicles were still imbued, let's assume, with, I don't know, this ideological, propagandistic thing that these guys were not really what they were, but just champions of Islam, or the great Khans of the steppes, and everything went accordingly to certain historiographical traditions and stereotypes and cliches. And maybe we don't have much about the details. So the Western observers are also particularly interesting, because they show you, you know, certain aspects of these populations that I don't know, maybe by the local chronicles were being given for granted. So González de Clavillo writes something like this: when Tamerlane calls his people to war, all assemble and march with him, surrounded by their flocks and herds, thus carrying along their processions with them, along with their wives and children. These last follow the host, and in the lands which they invade their flocks, namely and particularly the sheep, camels, and horses, served to ration the horde. You must understand further that none of these Chagatais, when on the march with their hosts, ever separate from their women and children or from their herds and flocks. So here we have even a Western observer that tells us that everybody came along with the army, right? Once again, this doesn't really explain those numbers we heard before. And we here it's even referred that basically the soldiers' wives were employed in certain in combat. Actually, only one campaign, by the way. That is fair. There is the same. I think the same Castilian diplomat says something like Tamerlane issued orders that all the women who marched with his soldiers should don helmets along with the men wore harness to play the part of soldiers. Thus the camp was left in charge of the women disguised as warriors. And this is particularly fascinating because it tells you basically that at least a part of Timur's army was composed of men who traveled with their own families, basically, and whose women in this case were engaged into operations being disguised as men, which means that usually, obviously, they didn't have to fight, but that on the distance, they could be mistaken for men, especially when dressed with their arms and equipment, and that could, in this case, defend the camp, which is something that you find historically also in other, in other episodes. I don't know, think about the ancient. This is typical, in fact, of migrating peoples. This happened even in migrations, Teutonic or Swabian troops that Swabian peoples that we mentioned that video on the Gallic Wars. There were women alongside them, yes, because there were people really shifting altogether. What these diplomats, in my opinion, really mean is that this was the natural lifestyle of the average, say, shepherd, the average horse breeder that was in the base of Timurid cavalry. But this refers only to those troops that in fact lived in the steppes habitually like this. But it still doesn't mean that the whole armies were composed by these kind of troops. We will look at how these troops were also paid and rewarded. There is, however, another very interesting witness by Bertrandon de la Brocquière that similarly refers generally to the readiness of Turkish women to bear arms, right? And this is something that is stated for actually for the Ottomans of Kayseri in Turkey that had 30,000 Turkoman soldiers and about 100,000 women as brave and as fit for combat as men. And that even in Albistan, that is basically on the frontier with Timurid Persia, that the dual Kadiroglu Turkoman confederation had something like 30,000 women who thus bear their turquoise, and as well as 30,000 men. So here what it means, naturally, still looking at these populations that lived in a at least semi-nomadic fashion, that went with their women and it's interesting, especially the first one, that I don't know how realistic it is, by the way, because Kayseri was there was still probably a kind of semi-nomadism in part existing in Anatolia at this time, but that the Amir of Kayseri, that was also a pretty consistent center had under his command 30,000 Turkoman men and 100 women. As brave and as fit for combat as men, it sounds like a bit weird. I mean, first of all, why this proportion in the first place? Secondly, you know, it's not that this fashion, let's say, it's recorded, I don't know, in other Turkish populations, for example, in Anatolia proper. It's something you can find definitely in the steppes often, but that's simply because those are world peoples on the march, which is very different from saying that, you know, you have from a sedentary empire where, you know, basically I don't know, I mean, matrilinear and I don't know how to say that, the, you know, societies in which are women that have the control of policy and military are extremely rare all over human civilization. They basically are something extremely rare, and definitely in there it didn't quite happen really. So and there is a great misunderstanding sometimes, not just for these nomadic populations, but sometimes of other societies where maybe women have some, for example, interesting and important role in the administration, let's say, but and for that reason you think that that's a matriarchal society. Well, that's not what matriarchal society is, anthropologically speaking, and that's not really how that society is. And in this context, I see it still very difficult. So these accounts are very, you know, they should be interpreted better. But I think that the substance here is that there was still a lot of nomadism around, for which definitely women followed. Women, like any other element of society, basically followed the army in itself. So, pays in the Timurid army varied, because in here the concept is that as long as you are a tribal warrior, the reason for which you fight is normally enough to make you do it for free. And that's why you're a tribal warrior in the first place. That is to say that you're always out there to survive. So the concept of pay that seemingly existed in Timurid's armies for soldiers every 6 months orientates that something has changed. There is now to stress the kind of more sedentary side of this empire. Sometimes this pay could be not really literal. It could be just an exemption, for example. They could have certain market exemptions. They could maybe not pay certain. This was usually associated to duties, right? And still, however, this pay was ideally not just a gift, something like, you know, for the military service, but in itself, but for covering the expense of the horse, especially. In the sense that, for example, this pay that was received was exactly the equal sum to the market value of the best horse of the soldier, right? So not even the only the whole military expense, because it doesn't include equipment, but also usually in these armies there was on average more than 1 horse per man. Actually, there were some regulations that said that there had to be one spare soldier, 1 spare horse for every 2 horsemen, something like, yeah, I think it was so. And we can imagine that the average nomadic or semi-nomadic warrior in Timur's service would have definitely more than 1 horse by the foe. And this is something not so strange, actually. Even in Western armies, how they were developing at the time were fundamentally having spare horses for, you know, bringing the squires with them, and for loading other stuff and for having a change, a fresh spare horse to change during the fight and all this stuff. So at least in the steppe, it was pretty normal to have this reserve, and also because by default the tribal warrior usually lived, as we said before, through what he could have from that horse in terms of milk, of meat, and these were usually, in fact, they had a pastoral life, right? They were shepherds. They usually lived through livestock, right? And that's why it was relatively easy for them to have one, if they were at least wealthy enough. But and the interesting thing here is that it shows that there was a sort of best horse, and it's obvious that among some horses there was always the best one, but here it's probably entailing that there were really different types of horses probably that were brought alongside with the army, and they were counted as such for the retribution. But elite troops had other advantages. For example, they could receive a much higher pay of 2 to 4 times as much than the average warrior. The concept behind this is, well, for the one of elite troops is kind of real, and we will see now. It's kind of obvious, and we'll see now, especially the Tarkans and who they were. But the concept behind the average horseman having his retribution based just on the equivalent of his horse every 6 months really tells you, well, obviously it can be quantified. Maybe it's more than the actual value of the horse and stuff, but it's still tied to the conception that you don't really have to serve because you're a soldier, in the sense you're someone who's servicing for money, but because you're under someone who vanquished you, or you have to obey to for some reason. And this is the typical mentality of the steppe, that is also kind of typical tribal mentality in absolute terms. That is to say, you not only have a duty but also an honor to belong to the steppe army, to the army of the great overlord. So you should be a normal datum for the tribal warrior to go out there to war and not to ask for anything. Then it happens that the horse get wounded and crippled and other stuff, or killed, and then you require compensation, because that's not really a few, but still the military service that you owe to your overlord is all that matters, and you shouldn't ideally have any retribution with that. There were naturally other forms of retribution. There was definitely money, in real coins, not just in... We can imagine that barter was pretty much out there. These armies looted a freaking lot, so there was, in a measure, at least a redistribution of the loot that sometimes even entailed additional weapons that were maybe distributed before battle. And this is typical also tribal world. And there were, however, some troops that some soldiers that distinguished themselves and were therefore rewarded with promotion or being named as Tarkans. Now, the Tarkan basically was exempted from taxes. It entailed that the booty he seized, he won in future campaigns as well, belonged to him, so it could be kept, because otherwise all the other loot had to be put in common and eventually redistributed on the base of the, by the decision of the overlord. So that is also particularly important, because traditionally, the free warrior should take normally, right, what he seizes. But so this stresses naturally how stratified and how, if you want, centralized, given the standards, this societies were at this point. for which it's obvious that there was a management from the above. Remember that in every society there is always a degree of centralization. Never hear to people tell you, that there is no centralization because, let's say, we're not in modern Europe yet. It doesn't mean anything. Modernization is always there. Centralization is always here because otherwise a society could not work. It would be pure communism, and basically society would collapse after a while, because nobody can put things together and give an order with a leader that is functional hierarchically to make a society progress, to invest, to make resources wisely invested and channeled towards something productive. So the Tarkans had this were recognized as sort of further manhood. That is to say, it's not that obviously manhood was acquired through all the various anthropological rituals of these societies. It wasn't a matter of this, but this was further. This entailed a sort of superiority of nobility, and in fact Tarkans had seemingly a sort of by the way, they formed a sort of order of chivalry, right? That became over time even a title that could be inherited by their descendants for 7 generations. So here it tells you even the importance that was attributed to the lineage, to the dynasty, to the stock. These people cared very much, because the idea was that if you had achieved, you had accomplished so much, it was because of your warlike ethos that you somehow passed on the various generations. Tarkans, interestingly enough, the Tarkan title was extremely prestigious, and a proof is that basically you could commit up to 9 crimes before being prosecuted by law if you were a Tarkan. That is to say, okay, you risk your life, you prove to be, and therefore you have as a prize you can commit crimes. It's kind of weird, but evidently this means that if it had really functioned, everybody first of all would have been a Tarkan, because everybody would have been so courageous, and that is very rare instead. So there were probably very few Tarkans, and the mess that they were let's say allowed to do without punishment, with which they could get away, was evidently something that could be reabsorbed in society. Naturally, would be interesting. By the way, these were probably very ad personam, decisions, even in terms of if obviously the Khan wanted you could be punished anyway, but it was still a way to keep up a bit of social order, of hierarchy, of discipline, and of selection, actually, because it's obvious that if you are going to have all these privileges, you may really want to risk to get them. So this boosts the the army's courage and determination and competition. So it's particularly important. And the widows of Tarkans were were endowed certain similar favors that otherwise their husbands would have enjoyed, if they had remained alive. So this was also a way to provide theoretically for your family. Now it's interesting enough in this military culture, even the existence of duels. Even Timur himself and his descendants occasionally fought such duels. So this was a world that was still permeated both with the Persian idea of chivalry and the idea of honor and glory, typical of tribal societies, and then there was a strong warlike ethos in this sense. Sometimes it was naturally, just a sort of an excuse. I mean, duels are to be found very recently, even in the Western world, but naturally tribal mindset was, basically disappeared. But it was a way to affirm leadership, right, and to have this strong commitment. and the favors increased, the retributions increased. For example, the onbashi officer that we've seen before commanding 10 men received 10 times the pay of a trooper. The Yutsubashi 3 times as much as the onbashi, and then the binbashi 3 times as much as the Yutsubashi plus, and from here started an amount of land, whilst the amirs received large estates akin to the Muslim Ikta system. So this form of retribution for the officers is particularly interesting. So you have 10,000. I think it's rare to find in history of an officer that is paid like 10 times more than when, let's say, as much as the number of troops that are under his command. This definitely happened only for the sort of squad or platoon commanders, let's say, and this probably has to do with the nature of the mounted nature of Timurid armies, for which what the individual swarm of troops has to do as a monad fundamentally is what really counts a lot on the battlefield. You know, that the tactics employed by these troops was, you know, hit and run. They required a lot of coordination. It was carried out usually by this singular, in fact, manifolds of troops that went back and forth doing this, and they need an effective leader that could spot, you know, it had to be aggressive enough but wise enough, so probably was a lot of emphasis put on them. Then if the Yutsubashi instead that commanded 10 men was paid only in proportion to the onbashi only 3 times. I mean less even than 1/3, because basically was only 3 times the onbashi, right? This means that probably that's still relatively that's very important naturally, but there is no proportion, of course. The guy gets paid only 3 times as much as the troops that is commanding. Let's say, excuse me, as yeah, so let's win the 1/3 that or whatever I'm saying, excuse me, that is paid, so 100 3 times, well, okay, so he, however, gets less than 1/3 in proportion to the troops that is commanding compared to the onbashi, right? So that's significant. Then you have the binbashi that is paid 3 times more, right? So it kind of follows the same trend, but he gets a grant of land. So here, basically, the binbashi, as we said before, was commander of 1,000 men. So that starts being, you know, a big chunk that has to, you know, whose commander has to make certain considerations that go beyond, let's say, the concerns of, let's say, company commander, right, that are larger, and therefore they also have probably more. By the way, their individuals are probably more into the politics of the situation, not just the strictly military element. He gets land, so he's someone who can get on average more power than the other officers. And then the amirs that command the larger 2 men of 10,000, so these are really big guys, let's say, get very large estates that are very similar to this Muslim feudal, let's say, system of the Ikta that you find in any other Muslim power at the time, that in fact remains, you know, the emir is this leading figure that has also some important functions, even as a governor, etc. So and this is interesting because it shows you here is that progressively during the Timurid Empire, the various troops get sedentarized. So getting sedentarized means that the empire naturally transforms also from from a social perspective. So these are, in other words, hungry soldiers that are fighting for something more, and definitely the nomad has lust for sedentary land, and that's what he's fighting for. So progressively, this force is led not just because it has to participate. As we have seen before, there is obviously something more than the mere pay for compensations. There is of military losses. I mean, there is loot, there is other things, and these guys are fighting for land, for a better life in a way. That is, however, creating another world. A world of politics and war that, in fact, is the one that, as we've seen before, progressively disintegrates the unity of the empire. And that is, in a nutshell, the story of all these nomadic populations sedentarized. It had happened to the Turks, it happened to the Mongols, and they all developed this kind of, if you want, decentralized system that, at the end of the conquests, that also exhaust considerably the local resources, have to restart from those, because that's basically also, these are the only people who have remained left after all the destructions and wars and ravaging and so on. So it was a great way. War is always a business in many ways, not in the way it's, like a game. The idea is this great expeditions were meant to raid and pillage and destroy, and this is naturally a way to wipe out a lot of people, seizing their power and going with this wealth somewhere in, starting something similar to what they had done on your own this way. So it's relatively simple, but it has its own logic, right? And it necessarily brings to sedentarization at that point, because Wu does go back to the steppe. Actually, of course, many did probably, especially those who hadn't had quite obviously, even these campaigns were in a way to become a millionaire in proportion. But it was sometimes just for surviving. I mean, that's one of the reasons of the fascination that existed, that brought to so many people to join these armies, because sometimes they were joined by relatively autonomous groups that just wanted to loot and pillage, but they maybe wouldn't have a share of the wealthiest lands, for example. That at that point is a decision Wood has settled into the conquered land. At this point is the great Khan that has to the Khan, at least, that has to decide that. So the infantry that it existed, some infantry. There was definitely some militia that was drawn. I think they were called the Sabadar, something like that. Yes, that were those militia troops that were recruited from the sedentary lands that were conquered by the, in fact, by these armies, and that usually had, as you understand, they were usually not mobile, but enough, at least as these cavalries were. By the way, these cavalries had particular breeds that made the marches very speedy, etc. So everything was calibrated, even strategically, on the base of those capabilities. So the local militias that are usually on foot are maybe just to garrison the local places, etc. But the idea is that they are not really first-class troops, and the idea is most of the troops are obviously not first-class either, but the fact that they're mounted That really makes the difference. And just imagine these swarms, by the way, the various accounts we have, even from foreign observers, etc., is that what they were struck by, and this is something that really was seen even in the ancient Mongols, etc., I mean in the old Mongols, etc., is that these armies were extremely disciplined. That is to say, they moved all at once, just with even obeying the order even before they heard it, just because they were so used to carry that out, that to perform those maneuvers, that they knew how it worked and how much it took. And this is typical of steppes, and it tells a lot about the military quality, the military average of these troops. It tells you how habitual it was to fight. This is probably the most difficult thing it's for us as sedentary people, and to realize what it meant to be natural, to live on horseback and to fight and to risk your life. So what made these armies great was the ability to impose that discipline that definitely in the steppe didn't quite exist in the modern sense, but it was enforced with this fear and this way of, either you find a solution or you die. Because most of the times, even if you weren't punished, you had to perform that. And these were cavalries that were definitely trained all their lives to perform these maneuvers, and to have this broader degree of coordination, of collective training. That is really what makes an army effective, and that's why these armies were so effective. Because once you reached basically the critical mass that you need to wipe out most of the resistance, you can go with them alongside. And naturally, it is not all. You still need some technical ability that we will see now existed out there as well, that shows a bit of evolution of these systems compared to the traditional Mongol ones, but or Turkish, by the way, because sometimes the same Turks preferred to be called as Mongols or Tartars, by the way, for convenience, because it was more prestigious, right, than calling themselves Turks. And the same Timurids were, in fact. One feature that sometimes it's very characteristic and exotic, if you want, of Timurid armies are elephants. Now, elephants had never been used actually by nor by the Turks, at least I know, but and definitely not by the Mongols. And these troops were captured by in Khwarezmia, actually, and this, that elephant warfare is something delicate, and often elephants are very difficult and cumbersome, that they're logistically extremely demanding. But similarly, Tamerlane was fascinated by them, even if when he fought against them, it's not that they had made much of an effort, because he had managed to defeat the armies that employed them, but still he wanted to have them. And that was even a way to show, the greatness of your empire, like using these different, surrounding yourself with all these, say, in fact, exotic elements that showed you how far your power fared in terms as an empire, etc. And by the way, what I was saying now, excuse me, is that the elephants he first saw, the capture was in Khwarezmia, but he didn't use these, right? He actually left them to die out in the desert. When he went in India, right, when he invaded India and captured and destroyed Delhi, he was fascinated by them. and he captured as many as like between around 100 basically, and he basically integrated them into his army. And it's interesting because you find these armies even in his western campaigns towards Turkey. In fact, at the Battle of Ankara, there is Monstrelet that in his chronicle writes that there were 26 elephants that had this kind of in Timurid army that had these small castles on their backs, and they seemingly, and he's not very explicit about what kind of equipment they had, on the turrets, but it simply says that they were harassing the enemy and being kind of grievous for him. The Battle of Ankara is when Timur defeats the Ottomans. And then there is this other German chronicler that had been in the Ottoman army. At the Battle of Ankara, he was captured by the Ottomans at Nicopolis, but then at the Battle of Ankara he was captured by Timur, and he actually served him. He was a Bavarian, who was Schildberger, and he actually told us a lot about that, because eventually he managed to escape at one point after having let's say served faithfully his lord, and he told us about these 32 trained elephants that were sent into the battle after midday, and he was allegedly there to see them, right? And there is also another source, that is Mirquand and actually two, and Sharaf ad-Din, that confirm the presence of elephants in this battle. And there is, in fact, even after Timur's death, some accounts mentioning occasionally field elephants in the Timurid armies. For example, the Battle of Alashkert against the Karakoyunlu in 1421. So they kind of the Timurids had a taste for elephants eventually, and they decided to use them in more than one occasion. At that point, it's also because obviously they had access to India. The Mongols had never done it, so that was historically. Whoever had campaigned in India, one or another, and winning some success had always kind of started using this, because India was plenty of them, quite simply. Sometimes these numbers are ridiculous. Even 100 elephants is really a lot, especially if you really use them. Of course, here it's written eventually that there were just some tens of them, but even some tens of them on a battlefield, if you use them properly, at least can be they're first of all demanding, but also they can have an effect, by the way. And the fact that they were trained also is interesting, so that they didn't just take them for some reason, but they also they started training them as well. And we know that it was relatively easy to have just a mouth, training them, and also in the ancient world it had happened in the same way. Now there is a lot of debate, at least, but it's not that we know this much about the use, probably, and I hope this will be researched one day more thoroughly, about the use of artillery in Timurid armies. We don't really know. Obviously, this was a moment in which both, as you know, in China and in Europe, gunpowder was in use. Its developments were really slow. Like the 14th century wasn't this moment in which artillery played, really a determinant role into battles most of the times, but it definitely starts appearing and having some extended function, right? Especially towards the end of the century. So, like in the 17th and 14th century, Europe has now relatively solid artillery tradition already in China as well. That Timur wanted to invade even at the beginning of 15th, so the time in which artillery was definitely developing more than. So this is interesting because the Mongols, and generally speaking, those who lived in their legacy, were not very keen on artillery. They had this very strong hostility and distrust and contempt towards these weapons. If you look at the Tartars of the Golden Horde, they were really they had gunners actually, and this is also interesting. Say the technology filtered, but they kind of mocked the troops who used them. Were stinking like with sulfur, and they looked all black because of the powder, and they were called like the chemists, something like that, and in contempt. And the reason being this strong warlike ethos that basically saw in the warrior on horseback like the best thing the world had ever imagined and seen and conceived. And in terms of manhood, of honor, and they weren't, after all, that anachronistic in this sense, because the world in which they lived really didn't make artillery very widespread. One thing is having, as it would happen in Europe and partly also in China, the development of a real like pike and shot tactics and development artillery, etc. When you control the steppes largely, and it doesn't matter how many cities you have in there, but it's still, the broader mass of the population has to do with, if not with the steppes, but however, even think the material culture of a place like Transoxiana, what it could be. You don't excessively need in the steppe to have artillery at this point, because technology is still very rudimental. It's logistically demanding. You see that even in countries that were kind of more westernized, still artillery relatively lagged behind. The more these countries were close to the steppes. We're talking about the Polish-Lithuanian artillery in one of our videos, and we observed that there was a development, but at the same time there were kind of what appears to be a more traditional way of warfare that, however, was still functional, for example, to the strategical needs of a dominion. Was very large, and it also encompassed large areas. So the artillery is something that they could at least initially afford not to take, at least for their lifestyle, being still semi-nomadic and having still more effect, definitely in the 14th and even still in the 15th century, on horseback than against artillery. It was very slow, had a very to reload, had in this sense a very low rate of fire, accuracy, and it was mostly used just against fortresses. And there is also another tendency that perhaps has been overly emphasized, but it partly is meaningful, is that the Eastern world, chiefly the Far East, like China, where gunpowder was first invented and developed, had a different tradition of employment of firearms. There is this Vulgata that says that basically the Chinese used gunpowder just for fireworks and not for war, while the Europeans immediately put it to war. This is false. Actually, the Chinese also immediately use it for military purposes. The problem is that there is a difference in the composition, for which basically there is more sulfur than saltpeter, and therefore what it turns out is that these weapons are more incendiary weapons than explosive. Shell throwers, shooters, let's say. So now we can't really address why this is the case, and it's very complicated. We will make perhaps a video about it. But therefore it seems that in large parts of Asia, and especially the ones that in this sense were more dominated by the Mongol, let's say, tradition, a bit of contempt and other factors brought to to this other, perhaps not to these the refuse of gunpowder, but really a different type of employment. What is interesting, for example, is that the Ottomans, that also, as we had seen, were they revered the Mongol tradition. In this sense, were way more open-minded, and they made relatively soon, not completely without cultural resistance in part, however, use of artillery. Even if you look at the Mamluks, for example, you see when artillery comes around in practice for the first time, the Mamluks immediately use it. They immediately use explosive shells, for example. The Persians, in this broader Eastern and more kind of Turkic and Mongol-influenced area, seems to make a less use of that. At the beginning of the 16th century, you have, for example, the Battle of Kaldiran. That is the battle in which the Ottomans defeat the Persians. Also, the Safavids are on the rise. That battle, for example, is a sort of pike and shot from the Ottoman side, winning over the horse, archer, and steppes tactics of the Persians. That after that time, learn the lesson and start progressively to introduce those technologies in their armies massively, structurally too. That is interesting, incidentally, because the Ottomans, from the Western perspective, were kind of, in this sense, with a few artillery. At least not really with a few artillery, but at least with because the Ottomans were actually on the lead on that. But let's say less firepower in the infantry. Like, while the Europeans were developing, arquebus fire as in line, just like together with the pikes. The Ottomans were they were using much less of that, and therefore it appears as if they were this kind of lighter thing, also with horse archers and stuff like that. But in comparison, the Ottomans, it's relative to the Persians, were still kind of much more Western, like, if we can identify calling the tendency of using pike and shot tactics in that way than the Persians. And it's however kind of unrealistic to pretend that in an empire like the one of Tamerlane, the black powder was not used, right? And actually, when you look at terms like Rad and Karabuga, that are respectively thunder and black camel, in 1379, when are used, that is associated to these weapons used at the siege of Urganch, for example, as recorded by Muin al-Din Natanzi. Well, you realize these are quite likely gunpowder artillery, right? So not throwing weapons, even though there are, for example, other authors, Nizam al-Din Dami, that uses similar terms for describing, for example, the guns, or at least the loud throwing guns, literally, in Tamerlane's armies, to the fireworks and rockets used at the Battle of Delhi from the side of the Delhi Sultanate. Now, this is interesting because it sounds as if, some have interpreted the loud throwing guns as something like the large trebuchets, right? Because there were, at the time, still, and it's still in Europe, even if the artillery had, and gunpowder artillery had emerged, this enormous trebuchet. I mean, the tendency had been historically to, in fact, have the idea of enlarging the dimensions, right, for being more effective against castles. And there were this kind of monster trebuchets that definitely were pretty loud throwing, but it's difficult to, at this point, to distinguish the term, right, from a conceptual, at least in its etymology, from a canon, but it still could be, because that's how specific the source goes, and we don't have this scientific categorization for those kind of weapons for us to understand what you're talking about. There is definitely in Shah Rukh's reign a gun founder named Farouk that is recorded to have made certain a kaman irad that could fire stones weighing 400 mount, which should be something like 6 tons, which is pretty much. So it's either a monster bombard or a huge trebuchet. In any way, this is definitely heavy stuff used for siege warfare chiefly, right? And it's also very difficult to transport. And even think about for example, that's where we were talking about, the idea that strategical mobility is also dictated by what you bring alongside with you. Here we are in a time which in the Timurid Empire was a bit more sedentarized, so that could be more useful also for strategically closer objectives and fortified cities, etc. But think about an army like the one of Timurid that has to go thousands of kilometers, and to move, you can't move with something like that, really, at least for most of the time. At least you have to bring it separately in some ways, and you can't deploy it immediately, and in terrain can be dreadfully difficult and all these problems. So sometimes the investment was not worth the pain. In that particular warfare was of the steppe was in this sense still beyond that. It was definitely effective without, and even using these weapons could be even not convenient, right? So what we can say about this Timurid army is that there was probably a sort of a semi-permanent force of professional into it that, as we have seen, was regularly paid. That in this sense was probably not really the model with the story of all the population that follows the army and all. It was probably already very differentiated from this. There was definitely a Mongol influence in the thing. By the way, that Timur has this relation with the various Mongol dynasties that ruled around, and as we said, he even married one of Mongol princesses, and he really cared a lot about the Mongol clans, so that sometimes in his elite picked bodies were drawn from those clans rather than the strictly Turkic ones, right? That the culture of this empire was definitely transitioning from a strictly nomadic one, or at least it was a blend already, and it was progressively intensifying. For example, even if you look at the equipment requirements, sometimes you realize that, for example, first of all, as we said before, there should be a spare horse every 2 men, right? A tent for every 10, plus 2 spades, a pickaxe, scythe, axe, 100 needles, rope, and perhaps a lasso, an animal hide, and a cooking pot. So this is the idea. And so this entails a military organization that is starting to go beyond, especially if it is it's regulated in this way from the spontaneous, let's say, warfare of the origins. Obviously, bow, quiver, usually 30 arrows were required for the individual soldier to go to battle. Food for a year's campaigning. This is, for example, still the thing that you can realize how non-literal it was. I mean, how can you really bring fundamentally with you the food for 1 year? I mean, if it's animals, it's understandable, but still, it's still a freaking lot of animals to bring alongside with you. So obviously the 1 year of campaigning maybe here is meant to be already something in terms of levies, etc., of taxes that eventually were collected, and for the central military administration to organize the expeditions. And this always happens, and especially after you conquer regions like the one of Persia, etc., you start expanding into areas that, but even Transoxiana had some form of sedentary organization that is easy to draw resources from in that fashion. So it was a very composite system, but at the same time more logical and more fluid than you may think. The idea is that there was also an aristocracy. We didn't quite focus on it, but that definitely provided the bulk of the heavier troops that had those fitness, fighting skills, and equipment and organization that really was the cream backbone of the Timurid armies, right? In fact, those requirements that were issued also were probably already they were required to single clansmen, not really to the single soldier, also because there was no bureaucracy and administration to really make this work. And largely, as we have seen, these armies were used from centuries, if not millennia, to work together without something like a true state or a bureaucracy or administration. They already knew how to make it work, right? And there's also another concept that can help in this sense, is that an army that functions, when you look at these great empires and at campaigns that really ravage entire nations and to have this continuous use, you can say at least two things. The first one is that these troops are tending towards professionalism. That is to say that here we're not talking about the tribal levies anymore. We're talking about something more habitual. We're talking about entire social classes that start working for someone else to go to war, that becomes a professional, that makes up the elite, etc. Secondly, that even given the geographical range of Timur-Lenk's conquests, that there is a great civilization hybrid. I mean, this is a guy who fought against Mongols, Turks, Persians, Afghans, Indians, Turks, Ottomans, to say better, Mamluks, the Khanate of the Golden Horde, specifically still kind of Mongols, but still all these various, and you can imagine what kind of, even though there was a relative homogeneity by certain standards in these military systems, but how this enriches, culturally speaking, in terms of civilization, a people in its political and military organization. War grows and gets fueled by these things, and that's why, by the way, these areas were very advanced. They were used to this kind of cross, this idea that every once in a while there was a conqueror that arrived and made back and forth for hundreds of kilometers at a time to go seize and conquer, etc. So this makes a lot of power and ideas circulating and stimulates different solutions and organizations, a reason for which probably when you look at the story of firearms, we know that today that those were the future, but at the time definitely, probably maybe some enlightened mind had kind of foreseen that, but overall it was really not the case, and we shouldn't project our awareness and our let's say modernism to say, okay, well, these guys didn't have artillery, so they were probably backward. No, it wasn't like that. They were primitive. No, these were armies that functioned and were some of the most effective armies ever. You can make a comparison, though. I mean, if Timur had invaded China, you may wonder, there were still the Mings from the other side. Let's be honest about it. So it's not that this, would have necessarily meant the Timurid conquest of China. But even these forms of political and military organization up to 1 century before had been really the ones that had managed to stretch from the Pacific Ocean to Hungary, basically, and to control that world and to be effective. And there wasn't anything really changing at this point, if not in terms of centralization. It was timidly, increasing in certain contexts, or just appearing maybe towards the modern model, but nothing more. And these armies were still the best freaking thing you had around. So in terms of technical, and that's when you look at the surprise of the Western observers that tell you that these armies really moved perfectly in order, perfectly in time, without even needing to hear orders, because they already knew what they had to do. And that's when you understand these were really the best armies around, and that they were so intensely trained and used to fight. And professionalism, that's really all of it. If you train a soldier to do that every year and every year and every year, the guy will get used to it. So it comes automatic after a certain time. Once you have already an empire that regularly feeds itself in through that way. Obviously, the real struggle is to emerge, and for this you need to have men like Timur, of course, that started from nothingness and arrived to being one of the most powerful humans on the globe, right? So I don't really know even how to title this video, because probably we didn't enter so so in detail to the matter, but I still think it was important to give an idea about these armies and how they really where they come from. I mean, in terms of organization, because that's crucial. It's the Clausewitzian trinity, always. You can't understand the military if you don't understand policy and society. And we have tried to look at that a bit today. And we will definitely keep talking about it, because the Timurid Empire is really something that changed the history of the world, even if, it's not enormously famous, especially in the West. I don't know how much it is famous in countries like Persia, or but it's one of the great conquerors of all times, and that's why we need to talk about him. And today was just about the Timurid army in general, right? So, all right. So this is basically it, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.